March 1942, Brisbane, Australia. Two Japanese-American soldiers in full US military uniform are physically shoved away from entering an American store by white military police. Not because they broke any rules, but simply because of their faces. But when Australian police witnessed this happening on their soil, they did something that shocked the entire US military command. They threatened to arrest American MPs for enforcing segregation. How did a foreign country force the United States military to treat its own soldiers equally, something America itself refused to do? The afternoon sun beat down on Queen Street, turning the pavement into a shimmering mirror of heat. Outside the American PX store, two young men in United States Army uniforms stood perfectly still. Their boots were polished to a high shine. Their uniforms were pressed and clean. Their faces were frozen in shock. Three white American military police officers blocked the entrance to the store, arms crossed, faces hard as stone. "Coloreds use the side entrance," one MP said. His voice was flat, like he had said these exact words 1,000 times before. He pointed to a narrow alley between two buildings. The alley was dark and smelled of garbage. A small sign hung crooked on the wall. Non-white personnel only. The two soldiers were Japanese American. Their names were on their uniforms. Their blood type was stamped on their dog tags. They had volunteered to join the army even though their mothers and fathers, their sisters and brothers were locked up in prison camps back in California. The government called these camps internment centers, but everyone knew they were prisons surrounded by barbed wire and guard towers. These young men had said yes anyway. They had raised their right hands and sworn to protect and defend the United States of America. They wore the same green uniform as every other American soldier. They carried the same M1 Garand rifle. They would face the same Japanese bullets and bombs. But right now, in this moment, they were not allowed to buy a candy bar in an American store. A crowd began to form on the sidewalk. Australian soldiers stopped to watch. Civilian men and women paused on their way home from work. Brisbane was packed with Americans now. Over 80,000 of them had poured into the city in just 3 months. That was more American men than the entire male population of Brisbane itself. The Australians had welcomed them at first. America was here to help defend Australia from the Japanese army that was pushing south through the Pacific Islands. But the welcome was starting to wear thin. One Australian soldier, a tall man with sunburned arms, leaned over to his friend. "What's all this then?" he asked. "Yanks won't let their own blokes into the shop," his friend replied. "Look at their faces. They're Japanese. They're wearing the bloody uniform, aren't they? Doesn't matter to them, mate." The first soldier's face darkened. He had heard stories about American segregation. Separate water fountains, separate bathrooms, separate seats on buses. Black soldiers forced to give up their seats to white soldiers. But hearing about it was different from seeing it happen right in front of you, on your own street, in your own city. The statistics were staggering, though most people did not know them yet. 1 million non-white men served in the United States military. 400,000 of them were stationed overseas, scattered across England, North Africa, the Pacific Islands, and now Australia. They dug ditches and unloaded ships and drove trucks. The military kept most of them away from combat. The official policy said that non-white soldiers were not fit to fight alongside white soldiers. They were good enough to carry supplies, but not good enough to carry rifles into battle. General Douglas MacArthur had set up his headquarters in Brisbane just weeks ago. His command had immediately established rules. Certain hotels were for white soldiers only. certain restaurants, certain dance halls, signs went up overnight, white personnel only. The Americans expected the Australians to simply accept it. This was how America did things. If you wanted American protection from the Japanese, you accepted American customs too. The military brass saw no problem with any of this. A memo from February 1942 sat in a filing cabinet in MacArthur's headquarters. The memo was clear. Local populations should understand and respect American customs regarding race relations. The generals who wrote this memo truly believed that segregation was normal. They thought the whole world did things this way. They were certain that Australians would go along with it. After all, Australia needed America. The Japanese had already bombed Darwin. They had attacked Sydney Harbour with submarines. Without American help, Australia might fall. But standing on Queen Street that afternoon, watching two soldiers in American uniforms being turned away from an American store, something stirred in the Australian crowd. It was not a loud thing. It was not dramatic. It was a quiet anger that spread like a slow fire. An older Australian woman carrying a shopping bag stopped next to the tall soldier. "Why won't they let those boys in?" she asked. "Because they're not white, love," he said. She looked at the two Japanese American soldiers. She looked at the three white MPs. She looked at the sign pointing to the dark alley. "That's not right," she said softly. "That's not right at all." More people stopped. The crowd grew to 20 people, then 30, then 40. No one said much. They just watched. The two Japanese-American soldiers finally turned and walked toward the alley. Their shoulders were squared, their heads were up, but everyone could see the shame burning in their faces. Shame they did not deserve, shame that had been forced on them by their own country. One of the Australian soldiers, the tall one with the sunburned arms, spoke loud enough for the MPs to hear. "We didn't invite the Yanks here to bring their bloody race problems with us." The MPs ignored him. They had their orders. They were just doing their jobs. To them, this was normal. This was how the world worked. White soldiers here, colored soldiers there, simple, clean, orderly. But Australia was about to show them that not everyone agreed. Australia had its own problems with race. The treatment of Aboriginal people was shameful and cruel. The White Australia policy kept non-white immigrants out of the country. Australia was far from perfect, but Australians were about to draw a line in the sand. They were about to say something that would shock the United States military to its core. They were about to say 3 words that would change everything. Not here, not on our soil. The breaking point came 3 weeks later. Prime Minister John Curtin sat at his desk in Canberra, reading reports that made his jaw tighten. In just 7 days, there had been 12 separate incidents. 12 times American military police had enforced segregation in Australian cities. In Melbourne, they had blocked African American soldiers from entering a restaurant. In Sydney, they had removed Filipino American sailors from a movie theatre. In Brisbane, they had tried to stop Pacific Islander troops from dancing with Australian women at a community hall. Curtin was a quiet man, but he was not a weak man. He had been Prime Minister for only 1 year, and that year had been the hardest in Australian history. The Japanese were winning everywhere. Singapore had fallen. Burma had fallen. The Philippines were falling. Australia stood alone, desperately needing American help. But needing help did not mean giving up everything Australia believed in. On April 3rd, 1942, Curtin made a decision that would change everything. He issued General Order No. 1029. The order was typed on official government paper. It was stamped and signed and sent to every police station and town hall in Australia. The order said that all Allied servicemen, regardless of race or national origin, would be treated equally in all public places within Australian territory. The order specifically said that American military police could not enforce segregation policies outside American military bases. The order was clear as glass. Inside American bases, the Americans could do what they wanted. But the moment an American soldier, white or non-white, stepped onto Australian soil outside those bases, Australian law applied. And Australian law said no segregation in public places. The implementation happened fast. Brisbane Police Chief Cecil Carroll read the order on the morning of April 4th. By afternoon, he had gathered his officers in the main station. The room smelled of strong tea and cigarette smoke. 43 policemen crowded into a space meant for 30. Carroll stood at the front, holding the order in his hand. "Listen carefully," he said. His voice was rough from years of smoking. "If you see American MPs trying to segregate their own soldiers in pubs, in shops, in dance halls, anywhere off their bases, you are authorized to arrest them. Yes, arrest American military police for violating Australian law." The room went silent. One young constable raised his hand. "Sir, won't that cause trouble with the Americans?" "Probably," Carroll said. "But those are your orders. Those are the Prime Minister's orders. We enforce Australian law in Australia." End of story. 4 days later, the first test came. It was a Friday night, April 8th. The Trocadero dance hall on George Street was packed with people. The music was loud, a swing band playing American songs that everyone loved. The dance floor was crowded with soldiers and civilians, men and women moving together under spinning lights. 2 Filipino-American sailors stood near the bar, drinking beer and talking with Australian girls. At 8:47 in the evening, 3 American MPs walked through the door. They pushed through the crowd toward the Filipino sailors. The lead MP, a tall man with a thick neck, grabbed one sailor by the arm. "You two need to leave," he said. "Why?" the sailor asked. "We're not causing trouble." "This place is for white personnel." "Says who?" "Says me. Now move." An Australian police sergeant named James Murphy was standing near the door. He had been watching the crowd, making sure no fights broke out. He was a short man with thick arms and a face that had seen plenty of street brawls. He stepped forward, moving between the MPs and the Filipino sailors. "Those men stay," Murphy said. His voice was calm but hard as iron. "Or you're coming with me to the watch house." The lead MP stared at him. "This is American military business. This is an Australian dance hall on Australian soil. You have no authority here. Those men stay or you leave. Your choice." The 3 MPs looked at each other. The music kept playing. The dancers kept moving. Everyone nearby had stopped talking and was watching now. The moment stretched out like a rubber band about to snap. The lead MP let go of the Filipino sailor's arm. "This isn't over," he said. "Yes, it is," Murphy replied. The 3 MPs turned and walked out of the dance hall. Murphy looked at his watch. 8:52, 5 minutes from start to finish. He would write it all down in his report that night. Every detail, every word spoken. The news spread like wildfire. Australian police had faced down American MPs and won. Within a week, every police officer in every major city knew the story. They knew the Prime Minister had their backs. They knew Australian law came first, but not everyone was happy. Military liaison. Major William Stanton visited Curtin's office on April 15th. Stanton was an American officer assigned to help coordinate between American and Australian forces. He was a careful man who tried to keep both sides happy. This time, he looked worried. "Prime Minister, General MacArthur's headquarters has sent a formal complaint," Stanton said. "They believe your policy could damage relations between our countries." Curtin did not look up from the papers on his desk. What does the general suggest instead? That Australian authorities respect American military customs and traditions. You mean segregation? Those are not my words, sir. But that's what you mean. Curtin finally looked up. His eyes were tired but steady. "Major, Australia is grateful for American help. We need American help, but we will not turn our cities into copies of Alabama or Mississippi. Not now, not ever." Curtin had an unexpected champion. Frank Ford, the Minister for the Army, had been collecting data. He walked into Curtin's office the next morning with a thick folder full of police reports. Ford was a careful man who believed in numbers and facts. "John, look at this," Ford said, spreading papers across the desk. "In the first 3 months of American presence, there have been 89 documented incidents of racial confrontation. 71 of those were started by white American servicemen or MPs enforcing segregation. Only 18 were started by the non-white soldiers themselves, and most of those were them defending themselves." Curtin read through the reports. Each one was dated and detailed. Times, places, names, witnesses. The pattern was clear as day. "Send this to MacArthur's headquarters," Curtin said, "and send it to the newspapers." The Australian press ran with the story. The Sydney Morning Herald published an editorial on April 15th with a headline that made Americans furious. "Australia welcomes all who fight for freedom without qualification." The editorial was reprinted in newspapers across the country. Australians read it over breakfast, over lunch, over dinner. They talked about it in pubs and in shops and in churches. By May 1942, the policy was working across all major Australian cities. Business owners put up signs in their windows. The signs were simple, just a few words, but they meant everything. "All Allied servicemen, welcome." 847 venues in Brisbane, Sydney, Melbourne, and Perth posted these signs. Hotels, restaurants, dance halls, movie theaters, shops. American military command was furious, but they were also trapped. They needed Australian ports to supply their forces. They needed Australian air bases to launch their planes. They needed Australian cooperation to fight the Japanese. Grudgingly, quietly, they accepted the situation, but only outside base perimeters. Inside American bases, segregation continued. Outside, on Australian soil, it ended. The results came fast and they came clear. By June 1942, police reports showed something remarkable. Racial incidents involving Allied servicemen in Australian public spaces had dropped by 76% compared to March. The numbers did not lie. When Australian police enforced equal treatment, when business owners welcomed all soldiers equally, when the rules were simple and fair, the trouble mostly disappeared. For the first time in their lives, thousands of non-white American soldiers experienced something they had never known. They could walk into any pub and order a beer. They could sit anywhere they wanted in a movie theater. They could dance with any girl who said yes. They could eat in any restaurant that had an empty table. The color of their skin did not matter. Only the uniform did. Corporal George Nakamura was one of those soldiers. He was Japanese-American, born in California, 22 years old. His parents and his 2 younger sisters were locked up in Manzanar internment camp, living in a tar paper barrack behind barbed wire in the middle of the desert. George had volunteered anyway. He believed in America even when America did not believe in him. but America had never treated him the way Australia did. In July, George wrote a letter home to his family. The letter had to pass through military censors who read every word looking for secret information that might help the enemy. But George was not writing about troop movements or battle plans. He was writing about something simpler and somehow bigger. In Brisbane, I can walk into any pub, any cafe, sit wherever I want, he wrote in careful handwriting. The Australians don't see my face. They see my uniform. I never knew that feeling before. The letter took 6 weeks to reach Manzanar. His mother read it 3 times, then folded it carefully and kept it in her pocket. She carried it with her every day for the rest of the war. By late 1942, over 15,000 non-white American servicemen had rotated through Australia. They came for training, for rest, for medical treatment, for resupply. They spent days or weeks or months in Australian cities. And for that time, they lived in the largest integrated social space the United States military had ever experienced. Not because the military wanted it, not because some general ordered it, but because Australia said, this is how we do things here. But not everyone accepted it. White American servicemen, especially military police from southern states like Georgia and Alabama and Mississippi, hated the policy. They had grown up believing that white people and non-white people should be kept separate. They believed it was natural, right? The way God intended. Seeing black soldiers and Japanese soldiers and Filipino soldiers sitting next to white soldiers in Australian pubs made them angry. Seeing these non-white soldiers dancing with white Australian women made them furious. The opposition grew through the fall of 1942. American MPs tried to enforce segregation anyway, arguing with Australian police, threatening Australian business owners. Some white American soldiers took matters into their own hands. They started fights in bars. They harassed non-white soldiers on the streets. The tension built like steam in a kettle with no release valve. November 26th, 1942, Thanksgiving night. The Brisbane City Hall was hosting a dance. The hall was decorated with paper turkeys and autumn leaves shipped from America. A band played on the stage, trumpets and saxophones and drums filling the huge room with sound. Hundreds of people packed the dance floor. Australian women in their best dresses, Allied soldiers in pressed uniforms. The air smelled of perfume and hair oil and cigarette smoke. A group of African American soldiers arrived around 8 o'clock. They were engineering troops who had spent the last 3 months building roads and airstrips in the brutal heat. Tonight they wanted to dance and drink and forget about work. Several of them were escorting Australian women they had met at previous dances. The women laughed at their jokes, held their arms, looked happy. A group of white American soldiers from Texas saw them enter. The leader was a sergeant named Roy Hendricks, a big man with small eyes and a mean smile. He had been drinking since noon. He watched the African American soldiers walk across the dance floor with white women on their arms, and something inside him snapped. "This ain't right," he said to his friends. "This ain't right at all." At 9:15, Hendricks and 6 other white soldiers walked over to the African American soldiers. The music was loud. People were dancing. Nobody noticed at first. "You boys need to leave," Hendricks said. One of the African American soldiers, a corporal named James Washington, turned to face him. "We're not bothering anyone. You're bothering me. You're bothering every decent white man here. Now get out." "No." Hendricks threw the first punch. It caught Washington on the jaw, snapping his head back. Washington stumbled but did not fall. His friends jumped in. The white soldiers jumped in. Within seconds, 20 men were fighting. then 40, then more. Tables crashed over, chairs broke, glass shattered. Women screamed and ran for the exits. Australian police arrived within minutes. They tried to break up the fight, but the American soldiers turned on them too. White soldiers who had been fighting black soldiers now fought side by side against the Australian police. More police came, more soldiers joined the fight. The battle spilled out of the city hall and into the streets. It lasted 2 days. The military called it a riot. The newspapers called it the Battle of Brisbane. Military police from both nations finally restored order on November 28th, but the damage was done. 8 Australians were in the hospital. 14 Americans, dozens ached, more had minor injuries, black eyes and broken noses and cracked ribs. And 1 man was dead. Private Edward Webster, an Australian civilian who had been walking home from work, was shot by an American serviceman at 11:34 at night on November 26th. The bullet hit him in the chest. He died on the sidewalk before the ambulance arrived. The coroner wrote down the exact time in his report, 11:34 p.m. The incident forced both governments to act. American military command held emergency meetings. Australian officials held emergency meetings. Both sides were angry. Both sides blamed the other. American generals wanted Australia to back down, to stop protecting non-white soldiers, to let segregation happen. They argued that integration was causing the violence, that if Australia would just accept American customs, the trouble would stop. But here is what is remarkable. Australia did not back down. Instead, they doubled down. More Australian police were deployed to entertainment districts. They were given clear orders: protect all Allied servicemen equally, especially non-white soldiers who might be targeted. If American soldiers caused trouble, arrest them, white or not, rank or not. Australian law came first. Documents from December 1942 show that General MacArthur's staff proposed withdrawing all non-white troops from Australian cities. Keep them on bases or work sites, away from civilians, away from trouble. Prime Minister Curtin refused in a cabinet meeting. If America expects us to host their servicemen, they will respect our laws, he said. All of them, or none of them. The scenes from this period lived in memory for decades. Aboriginal Australian soldiers, men who faced terrible discrimination in their own country, who were not even counted as citizens, sharing pints with African American soldiers in Sydney pubs. Both groups knew what it meant to be judged by skin color. Both groups knew what it meant to fight for a country that did not fully accept them. They understood each other without needing many words. The smoke-filled pubs smelled of beer and sweat and hope. American swing music mixed with Australian folk songs on crackling radios. Uniforms from a dozen different units, all mingled together in a way that simply did not happen anywhere else in the Allied world. Not in England, not in North Africa, not on Pacific Islands. Only here, only in Australia, only because Australia said it would be so. By the time the war ended in 1945, over 350,000 American servicemen had passed through Australia. They came in waves, stayed for weeks or months, then shipped out to fight in New Guinea, the Philippines, Okinawa. Some never came back, but for those who survived, especially the non-white soldiers, Australia remained a bright spot in their memories, a place where, for a little while, they had been treated like everyone else. The policy of equal treatment stayed in effect throughout the entire war. Prime Minister Curtin kept his word. Australian police kept enforcing Australian law. The arguments continued, the tension remained, but the basic rule never changed. On Australian soil, all Allied servicemen were equal. The numbers told a clear story. Military analysts after the war studied the statistics and found something important. Integrated Australian cities had 60% fewer racial incidents than segregated American military bases in the Pacific Theater. Fewer fights, fewer injuries, fewer deaths. When people were treated fairly, they behaved better. It was that simple. But the policy did not immediately transform either nation's broader racial politics. That would have been too easy, too neat, too much like a fairy tale. Real history is messier than that. Australia kept the White Australia policy in place for almost 30 more years. This cruel law blocked non-white immigrants from entering the country based purely on race. It was not abolished until 1973. Aboriginal Australians continued to face terrible discrimination, denied basic rights, removed from their families, treated as less than human in their own land. Australia had stood up for non-white American soldiers, but still oppressed non-white Australians. The contradiction was painful and obvious. America's military remained segregated after the war ended. Black soldiers came home to the same racism they had left behind. Japanese American soldiers returned to find their families still imprisoned, their homes and businesses stolen or destroyed. The military did not officially integrate until July 1948, when President Harry Truman signed Executive Order 9981. Even then, the change happened slowly, with many commanders resisting for years. But something had shifted, even if it was small, even if it was incomplete. Australian veterans who had witnessed integration during the war became some of the loudest voices demanding change in the 1960s. They had seen it work. They had seen men of different races working together, drinking together, laughing together, and the sky had not fallen. When politicians argued that integration would cause chaos, these veterans knew better. They had been there. They had seen the truth. Aboriginal rights activists pointed to wartime Brisbane as proof that integrated public spaces did not lead to disaster. If American and Australian soldiers of all races could share pubs and dance halls during wartime, why couldn't Aboriginal and white Australians do the same during peace? The argument was simple and hard to refute. For the soldiers who had been there, the ones who lived it, the legacy was deeply personal. Corporal George Nakamura survived the war. He joined the 442nd Regimental Combat Team, a unit made up entirely of Japanese American soldiers. They fought in Italy and France and became the most decorated unit in American military history for their size and length of service. George earned a Bronze Star for valor, running through machine gun fire to pull a wounded soldier to safety. In 1967, George returned to Brisbane. He was 47 years old now, married, father of 3 children. He walked down Queen Street on a warm afternoon, remembering that day in March 1942, when he had been turned away from the PX store. The store was gone now, replaced by a modern building with big glass windows. But George remembered exactly where it had stood. He walked into a cafe and ordered a coffee. A young waitress brought it to him, smiling. She had no idea who he was, no idea what had happened on this street 25 years ago. To her, he was just another customer. George sat at a small table by the window, watching people walk past, and felt something loosen in his chest. No one had stopped him. No one had pointed to a side entrance. No one had made him feel less than human. Prime Minister John Curtin never saw the full impact of his decision. He died in office on July 5th, 1945, exhausted by the strain of leading Australia through its darkest years. He was only 60 years old. Japan surrendered 5 weeks later. Curtin's grave is in a quiet cemetery in Perth, marked by a simple stone. He made many decisions during the war, commanded armies, allocated resources, made life and death choices. But General Order Number 1029 might have been his best decision, the one that said the most about who he was. The order itself remained in the archives, a piece of paper yellowed with age, typed words fading. But it became a case study in leadership courses, in ethics classes, in discussions about moral courage. Because Curtin had faced an impossible choice. Australia desperately needed American help. Japan was winning. Australia might fall. Saying no to America on anything seemed like suicide. But Curtin chose principle over expedience. He chose human dignity over military convenience. He risked the alliance to defend people who were not even his own citizens. What does this story teach us? That laws and policies, even in the midst of existential crisis, even when survival is at stake, reflect our deepest values. That the easy choice is usually not the right choice. That sometimes the greatest act of alliance, the truest form of friendship, is refusing to compromise on what matters most. It teaches us that soldiers fighting for freedom deserve to experience it, even briefly, even imperfectly, before they are asked to die for it. That you cannot credibly fight tyranny abroad while practicing injustice at home. That the uniform matters more than the face wearing it, or at least it should. In 2024, 82 years after those events, a memorial was proposed for Queen Street in Brisbane. The location was carefully chosen, the exact spot where those two Japanese American soldiers had been turned away in March 1942. The design was simple, a bronze plaque set into the sidewalk. The inscription read, "They came to fight tyranny. We chose to treat them as equals. Both were acts of courage." The Americans came to Australia expecting gratitude and compliance. They had the ships, the planes, the guns, the power. They assumed Australia would accept American customs without question, including segregation. What they got instead was a mirror, one that reflected an uncomfortable truth. You cannot export democracy while practicing discrimination. You cannot spread freedom while enforcing inequality. Australia in 1942 was not perfect. It was not enlightened. It was not even particularly progressive by today's standards. The White Australia policy was in full force. Aboriginal people were treated shamefully. Australia had deep racial problems of its own. But for those servicemen who spent time in Brisbane, Sydney, Melbourne, it was something they had never experienced in their own country. A place where the uniform mattered more than the face wearing it. A place where they could walk into a pub and be treated like everyone else. A place where they were soldiers first and race came second. That was the world they were fighting for, the world they hoped would exist after the guns stopped firing. Australia, imperfectly and temporarily, let them live in it. For many of them, it was the only time they ever did.